Minister Ong Ye Kung.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I thank members who have spoken on the bill and for their support of its introduction. I think there are quite a bit of comments about protecting consumers, protecting seniors, educating the public on the risks of DPTs or digital payment token service. But there are also others who commented that we should not over-regulate and we have to encourage entrepreneurship. So I think this is, in essence, what this bill is about, to strike that balance and in that process, take a risk-differentiated approach. And when we passed this bill, and I did so in January 2019, and we explained this, it is fundamentally the entire architecture of this bill, of the Act, of the Payment Services Act, to have different classes of licenses, differentiated approach, and take a risk-based principle and adopt the principle of taking a risk-based approach. Now, let me address members' questions, quite a number of them. Let me try my best. First, let me deal with the risk that the bill mainly seeks to address: money laundering, terrorism, financing, and other illegal activities. Mr. Louis Ng suggested sharing more information and feedback with financial institutions to improve the efficacy of suspicious transaction reporting. Mr. Louis Ng asked this question in the context of identifying illegal wildlife trade, but really the broader purpose is to counter all illegal activities in general. Financial institutions are required to report suspicious transactions to the Suspicious Transaction Reporting Office in the Singapore Police Force. Relevant agencies have shared case studies and red flag indicators on risk with financial institutions to help them better detect and report these illicit activities. Agencies also provide feedback to financial institutions to sharpen their efforts in reporting suspicious transactions. So the effort suggested by Mr. Ng is ongoing. Mr. Don Wee also asked if there could be a centralized platform for DPT service providers to research on transaction details, share information, improve efficiency. We agree with this suggestion, the principle of it, and MAS has been working with the industry and relevant associations on the sharing of emerging risks and typologies and best practices to collectively raise anti-money laundering and counter financing of terrorism standards, AML-CFT standards, and improve their effectiveness and efficiency. Mr. Louis Ng asked if there is a space for anonymized financial transactions. Usually that is cash, that's the most anonymized. But if it's digital, indeed, in this digitized world, everything we do, from buying something online to even surfing the net, we leave a digital trail that is in someone's possession, and yet we willingly do so. And usually that data is just to push to you the next advertisement that you should take note of. For financial transactions, where there are real concerns of money laundering or terrorism financing, it is all the more necessary to have regulations that require the keeping of data and records. Hence, MAS imposes stringent AML-CFT requirements on licensed DPT service providers in Singapore to mitigate against the risk of abuse of our financial center by bad actors. Mr. Yip Hong Wing also raised questions on whether these service providers would be required to identify and verify their customers. In line with the FATF standards, DPT service providers must conduct Know Your Customer measures for this purpose. Payment service providers are also required to retain the necessary information on customers and transactions to maintain proper audit trails and facilitate investigations by law enforcement agencies. Mr. Don Wee asked if MAS requires DPT service providers to use search engines like in the maritime sector, to authenticate shipments. MAS expects DPT service providers to apply a risk-based AML-CFT approach that is appropriate for the risk of their business and nature of transactions. Hence, MAS does not prescribe the use of specific systems. However, DPT service providers should take enhanced risk measures, such as ascertaining the purpose of the transaction or source of funds using relevant sources of information when they encounter higher risk situations. Mr. Leon Pereira raised several questions. One of them is, he raised various instances where a DPT service provider need not be subject to perhaps the full suite of regulatory measures. These are valid concerns, and indeed, we, as I explained earlier, take a risk-based modular approach for the Payment Services Act, and in fact, that defines the entire architecture of this Act. So, for example, it is not the intent of the Payment Services Act to capture entities that conduct general marketing or advertising activities. Whether an entity is caught by the Act is dependent on the facts and circumstances of each case. The exact rules will be spelled out in subsidiary legislation or guidelines on licensing for licensees, and we will consult the public and the industry as MAS do so. I want to assure Mr. Leon Pereira that our rules are aligned to the FATF as well as international best practices. And this includes the regulation of cross-border remittance of monies. We are active in this space internationally, and we keep abreast of the developments and certainly not running ahead of international best practices. So whatever the legislation that we are proposing, US, Japan, Australia, Switzerland, several EU members have already passed similar legislation to regulate their DPT service providers. On monitoring cross-border flows that Mr. Leon Pereira asked, our rules require licensees to keep transaction records, and we have supervisory oversight to review them. So monitoring and enforcement is more ex post than ex ante, and of course we rely on active cooperation with foreign counterparts and sharing of intelligence. Also, as mentioned by Mr. Leon Pereira, MAS has carved out from regulation any payment service that is solely incidental to carry on a business that is already regulated under the Securities and Futures Act, and this is to avoid double regulation. On the need to provide clearer definition of the word incidental, it is already defined in the Payment Services Act, which is that a payment service is incidental if it is to support the other business and provided by the person in connection with carrying on of the other business. So if necessary, MAS can issue further guidance on this as we receive more feedback from the industry. Next, I will address crypto-related developments which were brought up by Mr. Saktiandi and Mr. Donwy, specifically on stable coins and decentralized finance, or DeFi, I suppose. These services are still nascent in Singapore, but it can change quickly. MAS has therefore issued a consultation paper to review if further changes are needed to address risks associated with stable coins. DeFi is currently the most common form of DPT services, which will be captured with the expanded scope introduced today. But if there is a need to evolve our regulatory regime further in future, we will be ready. Next are questions on technology and cybersecurity risks, as well as data privacy standards. Mr. Derek Goh proposed differentiated technology and cybersecurity requirements for payment institutions, and in particular, for standard payment institutions to perform self-assessment of their technology and cyber risk. The underlying principle behind Mr. Goh's suggestion is that MAS should take a risk-based approach when applying technology and cybersecurity requirements on different types of financial institutions, and we agree with this underlying principle. Payment service providers must meet MAS's standards on technology risk management and cyber hygiene practices. Examples of these regulatory requirements include establishing robust security controls to mitigate the risk of malware infection and data loss, and ensuring strong user authentication for systems that are used to access customer information. New entrants who are not able to meet these standards will not be allowed to commence business. MAS imposes more stringent requirements on payment service providers as they become significant players in the payment industry. Payment service providers are expected to independently perform risk assessment against these MAS's requirements. However, as part of our ongoing supervision, it is still necessary for MAS to periodically assess the cyber resilience of payment service providers by reviewing the effectiveness of their processes and controls. The amendments under the bill will allow MAS to impose additional requirements on DPT service providers to protect customers' data precisely for the reasons raised by members. For instance, MAS can impose stricter controls and processes to protect data from unauthorized use, in addition to the Personal Data Protection Act. Mr. Derek Goh suggested a rating systems for payment service providers. But unlike food and property development industries, payment service providers are licensed and subject to ongoing supervision by the MAS. I would thus encourage consumers to ensure that the payment service providers they engage, such as the platform they use to buy or sell DPTs, are licensed by MAS. Mr. Satyandi also asked, if cyber attacks lead to massive losses, how will customers be compensated and what are the penalties? In such an event, MAS will oversee the payment service providers' dispute resolute process to ensure that they handle customer claims fairly and promptly. Further, if the entity is found to have breached MAS's cyber hygiene requirements, it can be subject to fines up to $100,000 on conviction. The next set of risks raised by members, Ms. Ng Ling Ling, Mr. Louis Ng, Mr. Yip Hong Wing, Mr. Satyandi, pertain to fraud and scams. The first set of actions to prevent this is to have a rigorous, robust regulatory regime. MAS grants licenses only to entities that have in place proper governance and risk management processes. Further, MAS and the Commercial Affairs Department, or CAD, will take enforcement actions against entities that operate illegally or fail to comply with regulatory requirements. In response to Mr. Yip Hon Wing's specific questions, our enforcement agencies have the power to investigate, seize, and confiscate assets in their pursuit of DPT-related scam and fraud cases. For example, 2 persons were convicted in 2020 for promoting an illegal pyramid scheme involving a purported fraudulent digital token called OneCoin. The CAD has also to date removed or blocked more than 150 advertisements and websites promoting suspicious investments featuring or involving DPTs. Next, investment risk. Members are concerned that today's enhancements could give consumers a false sense of security and encourage them to jump into DPT-related investments. Some members may recall we had this same debate when we first tabled the Payment Services Bill in this House in January 2019, except the tables were then turned. Then there were requests that MAS regulate DPTs more strictly. I explained that we were not ready to do so because DPTs were still at a nascent stage of development and we should be mindful that more regulation may have a legitimizing effect. Compared to January 2019, while the usage of DPTs in Singapore remains low today, recent developments such as stable coins can spur greater adoption of DPTs within a short time. So it is timely to have new powers to be able to tighten the regulation, notwithstanding the concern of a legitimizing effect. The fact is DPTs remain unsuitable for most retail investors. Placing funds in DPTs like Bitcoins comes with very high risk. Today's amendments introduce additional user protection powers in the Payment Services Act, but it is not possible for laws to protect against investment losses. Ultimately, investors need to exercise extreme caution. They should seek to understand the product, its characteristics and risks before committing their money. Ms. Ng Ling Ling are especially concerned about seniors, and rightfully so. She suggested risk disclosures and suitability assessments for seniors. Mr. Louis Ng also asked if there are measures to prevent false marketing to mislead customers. MAS requires licensed DPT service providers to clearly disclose to their customers that they should buy DPTs only if they are familiar with the product and are prepared to accept the risk of losing all the money put into the DPTs. If DPT service providers make a statement that suggests that investment in DPT is protected under the Payment Services Act, MAS will require them to immediately correct or remove the statement, and they will be subject to enforcement actions. In response to Mr. Saktiandi's question, any entity which facilitates DPT transactions as described in the Payment Services Act today or in the amendments under today's bill, including persons facilitating transactions, will be required to obtain a license. So financial advice received in relation to DPTs may be separately regulated under the Financial Advisors Act. However, potential investors should be aware that not all the advice they receive in relation to DPT investments is regulated by MAS. Only advice concerning investment products are regulated under the Financial Advisors Act. Investors should check with their financial institutions if particular DPT investment they are considering is a regulated investment product and understand the risk of dealing in unregulated investment products. Whether digital tokens are used by issuers as a way to raise capital from the public, the issuers will be subject to the full set of regulatory requirements applicable for securities issuance.
Excuse me, Minister Ong, if I may ask you to give way to Leader for the purposes of exempted business. Thank you. Leader.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the business set down on the order paper for today be exempted at this day's sitting from the provisions of Standing Order Number 2.
The question is the motion moved by the Leader. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister Ong.
Thank you, Leader and Deputy Speaker. Let me repeat, whether digital tokens are used by issuers as a way to raise capital from the public, the issuers will be subject to the full set of regulatory requirements applicable for security issuance, such as the need to issue a prospectus. As suggested by several members, MAS will continue to educate the public. Before I move that, let me address another question by Mr. Leon Pereira, as well as Associate Professor James Lim. They voiced the concern of small players and license holders being caught under the consumer protection requirements. But this is where we also need to strike a balance. We want to encourage entrepreneurship, but at the same time need to protect consumers, especially given the current circumstances that DPTs can become more popular, companies can come up with products that is more attractive, and today what we are doing, we believe, is an appropriate and calibrated response. As suggested by several members, MAS will continue to educate the public on DPTs through the National Financial Education Program, Money Sense. We will also explore ways to better reach out to seniors, such as through mainstream media channels, working with agencies such as IMDA and SkillsFuture Singapore, and through the communities. MAS and the CAD have also rolled out consumer education initiatives to raise public awareness of the risks of putting their money in DPTs. Since 2017, several advisories have been issued to warn the public of the risks and of common tactics used by scammers to cheat people of their money or make use of them to carry out money laundering activities. We will continue our efforts together with the industry and the communities. Let me just have one more comment on what Mr. Louis Chua raised. He said that digital payment uptake is not fast enough, but actually digital payment uptake in Singapore is quite rapid. We can see many merchants taking up, individuals using, and this is after years of work, putting in place infrastructure such as the FAST system, then the PayNow system, which makes things a lot more convenient, and then the SGQR, a unified point of sale system. So all this helped create a very strong momentum of digital payment uptake. But when it comes to hawkers in coffee shops, in hawker centers, they are actually one of the hardest to convert, but we will continue to work on them. I think there are improvements that we can make, including on the software, on the user interface, as well as the user experience. And this is something that MAS will continue to work with agencies such as IMDA to continue to push the process. Finally, members ask about the risks to consumers and businesses who accept or hold DPTs for payments or as collateral for lending to DPT owners. As DPTs have little or no intrinsic value and their market value is highly volatile, they have not taken off in a big way as an accepted payment mode in Singapore. And it is actually quite a sensible outcome. Mr. Don Wee asked for an assurance that DPTs should not be used as a collateral to grant working capital loans. Businesses and lenders must understand the nature of DPTs, and those that wish to accept DPTs either as payments or collateral for lending to DPT owners would thus have to bear the risk of value depreciation. MAS conducts thematic checks on banks' collateral management practices to ensure that they maintain prudent credit risk management. There are, in fact, many alternatives to facilitate the normal conduct of business. Mr. Saktiandi suggested a scheme similar to deposit insurance to safeguard customers against potential losses. Mr. Don Wee asked whether capital adequacy ratios would be imposed on DPT service providers. Banks take in deposits and on-lend these funds. They play a critical intermediating role in the economy and are therefore subject to stringent prudential regulation and supervision, including deposit insurance and capital adequacy ratios. DPT service providers are not banks, do not perform similar economic functions, or pose similar systemic risks. We should use alternate means in our regulatory toolbox to deal with risk associated with DPT, which is what the Payment Services Act seeks to do. That is why the Payment Services Bill today provides MAS the powers to require DPT service providers to put in place consumer protection safeguards. Today, under the Payment Services Act, major payment institutions are required to safeguard customer monies by depositing them in a separate trust account or obtaining either an undertaking or guarantee from a bank in Singapore. Such safeguards currently do not apply to DPT service providers. With the provisions made, MAS will review the need to impose safeguarding measures on DPT service providers. To ensure all our regulations are not so onerous that we stifle entrepreneurship, let me reiterate the basic architecture of the Payment Services Act, which is that it is risk-based, 3 different licenses, 3 different tiers, with requirements calibrated to the risks they pose, and taking a modular approach. Associate Professor James Lim raised some questions. I want to assure him that the intent of the Act is to regulate entities that are carrying out payment services as a business and not for individuals. DPT service I also want to assure Associate Professor James Lim that DPT service provided in respect of the central bank functions is also carved out in the Act currently. The new user protection powers introduced under Section 21A of the Act is to empower MAS to impose user protection requirements when needed. It will not be implemented immediately, as I've explained. The adoption of DPTs remains small in Singapore, and it remains that we are regulating for MLTF. If MAS was to exercise the powers, the industry can be assured that we will keep to the principle of the Payment Services Act risk-based, modular. As such, it is likely that requirements will be imposed for major payment institutions first, and if we do not detect the same concern for standard payment institutions. Associate Professor James Lim also asked about money changes, and he highlighted that business is affected, and indeed so. But I think it is really not due to this legislation. Because of COVID, tourism has been affected badly, and that has affected money changes business quite badly as well, quite adversely. Also, they are affected by technology, as there are now alternatives to remittances. We have a 6 to 12 months grace period for existing players to transit into the new regulatory framework. So this applies also to money changes. So new applicants that are seeking to enter the market will not enjoy the 6 months grace period, which I think is reasonable. Several money changes have requested to MAS to temporarily cease their licenses due to poor business. Several requested for further extensions beyond the 6 months. And MAS will consider their requests on a case-by-case basis. As for higher limit on the stock and flow cap of e-money, as raised by Associate Professor James Lim, we will continue to study the issue. As members may know, these caps are actually enshrined in the main act, and so any changes we will have to consult and come back to the House to make the necessary changes. On Mr. Leon Pereira's and Mr. Louis Chua's requests for a success rate of application for DPT licenses, or service provider licenses, it is too early to provide a representative success rate currently. MAS has received over 300 applications so far. Many require very close consultations, even hand-holding and guidance, due to their unfamiliarity with AML requirements and the applicability of the Permanent Services Act to their business. So everyone is learning in this very fast-moving and evolving space, and MAS will continue to review how best to speed up the process and strike a good balance between encouraging entrepreneurship and regulation. Mr. Speaker, sir, the regulatory issues for payment services are multifaceted and dynamic as the industry continues to innovate and evolve. MAS seeks to ensure that its regulatory regime is aligned with international standards and that it has the necessary tools to respond quickly to market developments. With that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Payment Services Amendment Bill.
Committee stage what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 8 stand part of the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister Ong.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed without amendment.
Third reading what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Payment Services Amendment Bill.